In May of 1972, 25 students and teachers from Hamilton, Ontario, arrived in China as guests of the Chinese government. They were the first student visitors from North America since the communist accession to power in 1949. This film is a visual and sound record of some of their impressions.
Head office of China International Private Service to welcome you to China.
I expected China just to be a moving mass of people shoulder to shoulder, but it wasn't that way at all. There was so much open space.
Well, I found that the Chinese landscape, that China physically, is literally unchanged from the drawings you see. You know, the ancient drawings with the little trees all over the place and the rivers and this sort of thing, the mountains. It's exactly like that.
They managed to concentrate certain populations in an urban area, or even in their communes and that, and still have lots of open space. And they also tended to mix both agricultural areas and working urban areas. We visited an agricultural commune within the city limits of Shanghai, and it has half the population of Canada. And yet there was this 300-acre farm right within the limits. Quite often you felt like there was no direction. They didn't seem to have really a downtown area. It seemed to be like a conglomeration of separate little villages and little satellite cities, workers' residences they're called in China. You can see where the Chinese life is sort of geared into a very small area, which is why I guess the bicycle suffices as a means of transportation. That they just don't have the need of travel as we do in North America, whereas in China, everyone seems to be in small groups, and the schools, the factories, the shops, and everything are all in this very close area. And they had apartments, not the tall skyscrapers that we see here. And outside of these, they'd have courtyards and areas for people to walk. They'd also have gardens.
Of course, they don't have flower gardens or lawns, as we know. None of this grass in front of your house and flowers, because, as they say, what use is it? The only thing you can do is look at it. So why waste your time and why waste the land on this when that land could be used for growing food?
The gardens are not only there for productive use, but they're beautiful to look at. They're so landscaped and so meticulously planned that just to look at a cabbage patch can be, something enjoyable even in China. I think saying, too, that the Chinese are nothing but practical and realists is a little deceiving, too. We found that in most of the cities, they had these very beautiful parks. And you'd find the Chinese on their day off or perhaps early in the evening, and they'd wander through these parks. And I felt that this contemplative nature of the Chinese people, which has sort of been a tradition all through their culture, came out through this. And this would be about the only place you could get away from the revolutionary music and so on. Well, if we had a soundtrack of downtown Shanghai from 5:30 till 10:30 at night, you could hardly say that the Chinese are quiet. They have a consistent habit of constantly blowing the horn. And whether this is just to warn the cyclers and so on, because there's just innumerable numbers of them.
In the smaller cities, the predominant sound is sort of like a tinkling, like bells, little tiny bells rattling. You know how you have those mobiles, the mobiles that hang on and they tinkle together? That's the predominant sound of a Chinese city. I don't know, I hope I wasn't hearing things, but that's what I heard.
The lack of mechanization in Chinese industry hinges upon, first of all, employment, and secondly, the fact that China has been isolated. They've got 80% of the population in agriculture. Now, if they were to completely mechanize agriculture, what would they do with all those people? They would still have to be fed, yet they wouldn't have any work for them to do. As it stands now, under the present system, where they use mass human labor to build roads, to build bridges, to take care of the fields, they don't have an unemployment problem, plus they've got this growing amount of agricultural productivity.
Even though In all the communes that we visited, in all the factories, they seem to be very apologetic, and they kept trying to account for why they haven't mechanized to a full stability. But I don't think that they're going to completely mechanize. This would start to have a very impersonal effect on the people, that the people wouldn't have as an important part in the developing of the country and keeping it mobile. The philosophies of Chairman Mao seem to place man in the middle. Perhaps as North Americans may not understand, we expect progress, and progress means mechanization in most instances. But I think in China that they will probably retain a very high level of manual labor, even in the factories. The first thing that strikes you when you go into the country is how intensely the Chinese use the land. Nothing is wasted. Only 10% of the total land area is arable. You find on a typical commune sometimes up to 109 different varieties of vegetables being used. Whether it's professionals or not, everyone seems to have their time on the commune. So everyone seems to have a very close contact with this problem of feeding the nation. And so I think, too, having to work for it, I think they can appreciate it as well. They mix crops in such an unusual fashion. In the Northeast China plain, we found fields that would have strips of wheat. And when you look at it from a distance, it looked like the prairies, but you got close and you noticed between these strips, they'd have cotton and plant soybeans, peanuts, and that are nitrogen-giving plants. The rice paddies, for example. Around the edges where they built up like the little dikes for the irrigation, you'd find cabbages or pineapple even in the southern parts. So they're constantly the very unusual combinations, but each seem to complement the other.
They have been able to use their land very effectively for their population. And I guess the greatest example is just the Chinese food stores. You walk in and racks, walls filled with all these vegetables all over the place, and meat, plenty of meat everywhere.
More than enough. You'd find people come in and they shop daily. They'd go out and they'd have a meal hanging from their fingers. They'd tie a little piece of meat, and it would be from the baby finger, and they'd have vegetables from the next one, and all very open.
China must be the only place in the world that you can't get a bottle of Coke. It's just impossible. They've never heard of it, but they've got this infamous orange pop, which is about 80% sediment and 20% pop. So you carefully drain off all the sediment, just get a little layer of pop on top. Then the waiter comes along being very helpful and dumps the whole thing into your glass, and then you gotta let it. I guess the most obvious, the most outstanding point about Chinese education is that you don't have the discrepancies that we have here. In China, it is uniform throughout. In each of the various provinces, you have one level of education, and it's maintained throughout the country.
Well, it seemed that their political thought entailed just a regurgitation of the book of quotations from Chairman Mao and his 3 articles, that in discussions, philosophical discussions, it'd end up just the Canadian students, discussing this and having arguments. And they found this rather strange, that we could all come from one system and yet be arguing and not getting anywhere.
They introduce you to politics in kindergarten.
We found that politics at this level, the kindergarten level, entailed a type of show and tell. And it was rather strange in that the theories of Norman Bethune were brought out here, where they had discussed the article in memory of Dr. Norman Bethune, and the students would tell how perhaps they helped one of their friends home during a rainstorm, and they happened to have an umbrella and their friend didn't. And so this would be following the spirit of selflessness of Dr. Bethune.
In our school, it is a small factory. We work there once a week.
Practice and theory entails education whereby 70% of the school term is spent in the classroom learning the theories of science, of English whatever, and 30% spent on communes and factories putting this into practice. It's usually initiated right at the kindergarten level, but at a very, very basic form. And quite often this would entail putting small light bulbs in little cardboard squares or gluing paper bags. Eventually, when they reach the middle schools, they have small factories, some ranging from small steel mill operations where the students were actually pouring their own molten steel. Refinishing factory seconds like electrical fans, they'll fix them and they'll be put back onto the market. Or to put chemical theories into practice, they'd have industrial wastewaters and they'd decompose this and reclaim the essential chemicals. And the pure water would just be, put into the river and so on, but the chemicals would be sent back to the factories. So again, they were combining not only the practice for the students, but also putting it into a very practical aspect for the society itself. We found this all the way along, that they were really very conscious about, say, conservation and that too.
2 hours a day is devoted to physical education.
So they start in the morning with an hour activity of calisthenics and that, and usually at the end of the day, the students have the option of staying and participating in sports. And this is usually organized by the students.
The closest application of politics to their sports is the theory of friendship before competition.
Your basic interest in playing the game and playing with them was what was important. To alleviate this problem of competition, we found after the first basketball and volleyball game, we felt that it was a little easier if we took and mingled the students.
Anyhow, we were more willing after 4 straight losses.
In the performances, we saw more versions of the red detachment of women or the white-haired girl. We saw renditions right from kindergarten students up to the actual professionals. There's no variation in plot at all. It's always the red are victorious. Aspects than any, that this was the area that sort of, I think, bothered most of the students that went. And that when you saw the children in these costumes, with the makeup and so on, doing revolutionary opera, and the movements, I think, were really frightening because they were just so mature, they had clenched fists and they were, political. You really didn't think that they could understand what they were actually doing. That you realized that this was actually brainwashing in the early stages. But then there were films that have these students sort of caught out in the playground in the recess. And they, I guess sooner or later, they catch on that they're being filmed. And suddenly you see them and they start fooling around and they're making faces and, and just acting up like normal children do. And I think when I saw this, that it was a relief to see that beneath this, that they still, are individuals and they still like to fool around in this type. One of the dominant impressions that the students got when we were in China was this atmosphere of like a family, of everyone having an important role in the society. It seemed to work for their society with such a large population, with so much work to be done to build it up. When they saw the country profiting and progressing, it reflected again on them.
The oneness in Chinese society tends to eliminate things that we have here as a result of our lack of oneness. They don't have crime there, which I sort of attributed to the thinking that everybody is the same, so why would I steal from myself?
And then I think we had difficulty in sort of comprehending why these hundreds of thousands of people could follow this one philosophy.
Over half of the population has been born since the revolution. The greater part of the Chinese oneness is the result of being inbred with it.
Their happiness, of course, is defined in what they have, and what they have is certainly an improvement from what they had before. And this is continually what they told us when we visited families. They'd say, but the living conditions before liberation were such and such, and they'd usually tell us on experiences. One example was a woman remembered having to sell her sister for food and the exploitation by the Westerners and so on. But now she had her own apartment, they had luxuries, they had a bicycle, they had a sewing machine and a radio. And so they were infinitely grateful to the communist government.
They aren't burdened with the things that we are burdened with. They don't have to worry about taxes. They don't have to worry about paying hospital bills, about food costs. They don't have to worry about voting, about what sort of government they've got, that sort of thing. They don't have to worry about losing their jobs.
I think this bombardment of this promotion of the socialist country is something that you'd never get used to. The music, even though now it's nice to listen to, remembering what it was like in China, when you have it there and you can't turn it off, it's a different feeling. I think it would be a good thing if we could accept some of the admirable qualities of the people themselves, the honesty, the compatibility with one another and able to work together. But I don't think I'd ever want to live in China.
Here in Canada, you can sort of sit back and think, well, look, I've worked for 20 years, and now I've got, a home, a car, this sort of thing. This is the way we think, right? Accomplishment in terms of some sort of tangible gain. In China, they take away the personal achievement. They discourage this feeling of, well, I have done something. Instead, they replace it with a feeling of, something has been done for the state, and I have merely executed it.
But it just seems the happiness comes more from within the person in China than in North America. That
we've been born and trained into a way of thinking which is individualistic. And to be immersed in a situation as the Chinese have, where the individual really counts for nothing. A typical Canadian would have a nervous breakdown in China.
I know in North America you see signs and so on, and there's supposed to be this whole movement where people are supposed to be peace and all this type of thing. But it's just people just say it and they don't really act it. And in China, they are actually living this life. There was one example, and I think I'll always remember it. Really, you were so close to tears, I think everyone was. It was at one of the schools that we visited, the Wusong Middle School in Shanghai. We were having our traditional entertainment, but it seemed to have a little less politics in the songs that they sang. And there was one in particular that I think sort of struck us. And then our interpreter, after they'd finished the song, said that this is one that the students had written in our honor. And it was welcoming friends from across the sea. As it stopped, the students that had been performing the song and dance came up and took each one of us as students. So, you couldn't speak the language, so, there goes your grin. Again, you're smiling like mad. And there was an accordionist, and we were in circles. And so the Canadian students would go one way, and the Chinese inside would go the other. And you'd stop with a different student every time, and you'd sort of reach across, grasp hands, and wave type of thing. So you were building this friendship. And we went out down this lane. The accordion player was leading us. They were still singing the song. Every time it came, to this one particular part, they'd sort of grasp your hands really tight, that they were really glad you were there. We got on the buses, and the man was still playing it, and the school was still there. They were still singing the song. You put your hand out to wave, and they started grabbing your arm, and you'd see your friends, and you knew them. And as you pulled away, they were still singing the song off in the distance, and it was, it never happened before, and it could never happen again because it was beautiful.